In the 1950s, every off-highway dump truck in America was called a UC. Not just the ones built by the Euclid Road Machinery Company in Cleveland, Ohio. Every single one. Contractors on dam sites in Nevada, foremen in the copper mines of Bingham Canyon, Utah, operators hauling overburden in the coal fields of West Virginia. They all called their dump trucks EUCS, the same way we say Kleenex for tissue. Herbert Nichols wrote in his 5-edition textbook, Moving the Earth, that Euclid was everywhere. The company built 170 trucks per month out of its plants along St. Clair Avenue and East 222nd Street. That was more than half of every off-highway dump truck sold in the United States. General Motors paid $20 million in its own stock to buy them. The Department of Justice spent 8 years trying to tear them apart. By the time the lawyers, the executives, and the accountants were finished, the most dominant name in hauling history had been passed through 8 different owners across 4 countries, stripped of its factories, moved to another continent, and erased from its own machines. But here is what almost nobody knows about Euclid. Before they built a single dump truck, the Armington family built diesel-electric locomotives. Arthur Armington filed patent number 2,045,510 for a gas-electric switching locomotive in 1936. They built highway trucks, van trailers, and shipping containers decades before intermodal freight existed. Then they abandoned all of it to build the machine that would carry their name into every mine and construction site in the Western world. This is the story of how a father and 5 sons in a small Ohio hoist shop invented the purpose-built off-highway dump truck, built a hauling empire so dominant that their name became the word for the machine itself, and then watched every piece of that empire disappear. We are going to cover the Armington family patents, the machines they designed from scratch, the $20 million stock swap with General Motors, the Senate hearings where a Cummins executive destroyed General Motors' defense, the antitrust lawsuit that ripped the company in half, a gas turbine prototype that ran away down a mountain in Papua New Guinea at 60 miles per hour, and the Motherwell factory in Scotland that built Euclid Trucks for 76 years, until Volvo announced its closure 3 weeks ago. This documentary covers 8 owners, 5 Armington brothers, and nearly a century of heavy equipment history. And it starts with an electric hoist. The year was 1907. A man named George A. Armington founded a small company called Armington Electric Hoist in Wickliffe, Ohio, a quiet town east of Cleveland on the shores of Lake Erie. The business built electric hoists and overhead cranes for factories and warehouses in the Cleveland Industrial Corridor. Within a few years, Armington relocated the plant to the nearby city of Euclid, Ohio, and renamed the company Euclid Crane and Hoist. The city of Euclid had been named for the Greek mathematician by surveyors who arrived with Moses Cleveland in 1796. George had 5 sons, Arthur the eldest, Stuart, Everett, George Jr., and Raymond, the youngest. All 5 eventually joined the business. Arthur Armington had been watching the road construction boom unfolding across Ohio and the Midwest. The Federal Aid Highway Act of 1921 was pumping federal money into state road systems. Counties were grading and paving thousands of miles of rural roads for the first time. Arthur became convinced that the future of the company was not in factory hoists. It was in earth-moving machines. He spent years persuading his father and his 4 brothers to shift direction. In 1924, Arthur's persistence paid off. Euclid Crane and Hoist introduced the Euclid Automatic Rotary Scraper. It was their first piece of earth-moving equipment, and it sold well enough that a second model, the Euclid Wheeler Scraper, followed shortly after. Then a third, the Euclid Contractor's Special, designed specifically for hard ground conditions. The success led the Armingtons to create a dedicated road machinery division within Euclid Crane and Hoist in 1926. But Arthur was not satisfied building scrapers for other people's tractors. He and his father George built a prototype crawler tractor on the family farm and tested it. Benjamin Holt had patented the crawler track in Stockton, California, 2 decades earlier, and the technology was well established. The Armingtons had the engineering talent to build a working crawler, but they walked away from it to focus on hauling machines. George Armington Jr., one of Arthur's younger brothers, was experimenting with hydraulic dump mechanisms around 1930, at a time when virtually the entire construction equipment industry still ran on cable controls and manual levers. Then Arthur took the company in a direction that has been almost completely forgotten. Between 1935 and 1936, Euclid operated a railway transportation division. Arthur personally filed patent number 2,045,510 for a diesel-electric switching locomotive with 2 engine generator sets flanking a central cab. The division built several small locomotives before quietly shutting down. Even more obscure, Euclid manufactured over-the-road highway trucks, van trailers, and what we would now recognize as intermodal shipping containers, along with cranes to handle them. The Historical Construction Equipment Association has noted that technical information on this highway truck product line is essentially unavailable. Had these highway trucks survived into the General Motors era, Euclid might have faced antitrust scrutiny even earlier. And then the Great Depression hit America. Most equipment manufacturers collapsed between 1929 and 1933. Orders evaporated, factories closed, workers were laid off by the thousands across the industrial Midwest. But Euclid did not collapse. The big public works construction programs of 1927 and 1928 had already built demand for earth-moving haulers. Federal relief programs under Roosevelt's New Deal kept infrastructure spending alive through the worst years. Road projects, dam construction, and public building programs across the country needed machines to move dirt, and Euclid had machines to sell. On July 11, 1931, in the middle of the worst economic crisis in American history, the Armingtons incorporated the Euclid Road Machinery Company as a separate subsidiary of the Euclid Armington Corporation. They started with 300 employees at a small shop at 1368 Chardon Road in Euclid, Ohio, building 15-ton dump trucks at a rate of 20 per month for the construction and mining industries. By 1933, the workforce had tripled to 900 employees. The Depression barely touched them. If you enjoyed learning about another company that survived the Depression and grew into an industrial giant, the story of Alice Chalmers on this channel covers a similar rise with a very different ending. Like and subscribe to follow the full Lost Giants series. On January 1, 1933, Euclid Road Machinery became fully independent. The original hoist company simply vanished from the record. Then came a curious experiment. In 1933, Euclid built its first off-highway hauler prototype, a 5-yard, bottom-dumping semi-trailer pulled by a Chevrolet truck with a shortened wheelbase. It worked, but it was still a modified road truck doing off-road work. The real breakthrough came in January 1934. The Model 1Z Trac-Truk was a 7 cubic yard off-highway rear dump truck powered by a 100-horsepower Waukesha gasoline engine. It rode on a custom-designed Euclid rear axle fitted with brand-new 17.5 by 24 pneumatic rubber tires that the tire industry had just released. The entire vehicle was designed from the ground up for unpaved mine roads, quarry floors, and construction sites. The Hoover Dam construction had already proven that standard highway trucks could not survive off-highway conditions, where heat, dust, and steep grades destroyed conventional drivetrains within months. Mack had built a 14-yard hauler for Boulder Dam in 1931, but it was still a reinforced road truck. The Euclid Model 1Z was the first truck in the world designed from scratch exclusively for off-highway work. By 1936, Euclid had refined the design into the Model 1 FD. This was the truck that changed the industry permanently. The 1 FD combined a diesel engine with a modern driveline, leaf spring suspension, and pneumatic tires in a package that became the new baseline for every off-highway hauler built after it. The gasoline-powered, chain-drive haulers that competitors had been building became obsolete overnight. The 1 FD was faster, more reliable, and cheaper to operate per ton of material moved than anything else available. Contractors who had been modifying highway trucks for off-road work, reinforcing frames and swapping axles, and hoping the drivetrain would survive, stopped doing it. They bought Euclid Trucks instead. From quarries in Pennsylvania to copper mines in Arizona to highway construction sites across the expanding federal road network, the bright green Euclid Trucks began appearing on every major earth-moving project in the United States. But the man who made all of this happen did not live to see what Euclid would become. Arthur Armington died suddenly in 1937. He was the visionary who pushed the family out of hoists and into earth-moving. He conceived the scrapers. He filed the locomotive patent. He envisioned the off-highway truck market years before it existed. His sudden death shook the company. The 4 remaining brothers and their aging father had to carry forward a business that Arthur had shaped from its first earth-moving product. The youngest brother, Raymond, stepped into leadership at age 30. He was the least likely candidate to run a construction equipment company. Raymond held a bachelor's degree in industrial engineering from Ohio State and, surprisingly, a law degree from Pepperdine University. He had worked for 2 Akron rubber companies before joining his brothers. He would prove to be exactly the right person to lead Euclid through its greatest growth, its sale to the largest corporation in America, and its most painful transformation. Raymond became president of Euclid in 1951. During World War II, Euclid tripled its production capacity. The United States military needed off-highway haulers in quantities no manufacturer could have predicted 5 years earlier. Airfield construction across the Pacific Islands required trucks that could move coral and volcanic rock across terrain with no roads. Supply depot earthworks in North Africa and Italy demanded haulers that could operate in extreme heat on loose desert soil. Base building operations in England before the Normandy invasion required thousands of cubic yards of earth moved on tight military schedules across muddy farmland. Euclid Trucks handled all of it. The company shipped thousands of off-road haulers to the Army Corps of Engineers and civilian contractors working under military contract across every theater of operations. The wartime production push forced the Armington brothers to overhaul assembly line processes, quality control procedures, and supplier relationships for volumes they had never attempted. When the war ended, Euclid emerged with the manufacturing infrastructure of a company twice its pre-war size. But the real transformation came after the war. In 1945, General Motors released the Allison Torquematic heavy-duty automatic transmission, developed through wartime research on tank drivetrains. Euclid was the first company to install the Allison in heavy-duty off-highway dump trucks. Then in November 1948, Euclid did something no other manufacturer had attempted successfully. They installed 2 separate diesel engines in a single bottom dump hauler. The Model 50 FD T102W was the first twin-power truck ever produced. Each engine drove its own axle through its own Allison transmission. 2 complete powertrains in one machine. These machines competed directly with RG. Letourneau's electric drive scrapers used a completely different approach to the same problem of moving massive loads of earth at speed. Euclid sold thousands of twin-power motor scrapers using a single-axle tractor design called the TS series, introduced in 1954. Then came the TC-12, and with it one of the strangest crossovers in industrial history. When General Motors acquired Euclid in 1953, they needed a crawler tractor designed. Harley Earl, General Motors' legendary design chief, summoned a young designer named Chuck Jordan to his office and said he was giving him his first studio. Jordan's first assignment was not a Cadillac or a Chevrolet. It was a 46-ton lime green crawler dozer for the Euclid division. Jordan went on to design the 1955 Chevrolet Cameo pickup, the Buick Centurion concept car, and eventually became General Motors' Vice President of Design. He was inducted into the Automotive Hall of Fame. But his career started with a bulldozer. The TC-12 he helped create featured twin General Motors Detroit diesel 671 engines, the famous Screaming Jimmies, producing a combined 454 horsepower. The machine rode on two frame halves that oscillated independently over rough terrain and could spin-turn with one track forward and one in reverse. Operators called it the Jolly Green Giant. 901 units were built before the line was discontinued. One TC-12 was brought to Maine to build part of the Maine Turnpike. When the job was finished, the contractor did not want to pay to haul it back, so they left it there. A collector found it decades later in a barn. In 1950, the Armingtons established Euclid, Great Britain, and opened a dedicated truck factory in Motherwell, Scotland. By 1951, they produced the industry's first 50-ton, 3-axle dump truck with twin Cummins diesel engines. By the early 1950s, Euclid had reached total dominance. 1,600 employees, 170 trucks per month, more than half of all off-highway dump trucks in the United States. The trucks wore a specific shade of bright lime green, PPG paint code 45771, officially called highlight green. On any job site in America, a dump truck was a EUC, regardless of who built it. The reach was global. On the St. Lawrence Seaway construction between 1954 and 1959, more than 160 Euclid end dump trucks and 162 Euclid bottom dump trucks moved over 55 million cubic yards of earth across 13 contracts. At Bingham Canyon Copper Mine in Utah, Kennecott Copper deployed 30 Euclid 50-ton rigid-frame rear dumps loaded by Marion electric shovels in November 1958. At the Wabana iron ore mine on Bell Island, Newfoundland, 20-ton Euclid trucks replaced rail ore cars in April 1951. A driver named Pat Ezekiel Sr. hauled ore to the top of a cliff above Scotia Pier and dumped it into a natural pocket. Initially, only a low wooden wall protected the cliff edge. After trucks kept knocking it over, a concrete abutment was built. On September 26, 1955, a 21-year-old worker named Alphonsus Hocko Jr. was killed in a Euclid truck accident at that same pier. In New Zealand, dealer Clyde Engineering imported 124 Euclid R15 dump trucks in 5 different engine variants, including Rolls-Royce and Leyland diesels. Some of those R15s remain operational today, nearly 70 years after they were built. If you are finding this documentary about the rise and fall of Euclid worth your time, hitting like and subscribe helps the algorithm show this video to more equipment enthusiasts who have never heard the name Euclid. We have a full Lost Giants series covering the forgotten manufacturers that built this industry. But dominance attracts attention. The Armington family realized they lacked the capital to keep developing new machines. General Motors, the largest corporation in the United States, wanted into the earth-moving business. On September 30th, 1953, the deal was announced. General Motors would acquire Euclid for approximately $20 million in GM stock, not cash. Stock. The official takeover date was January 1st, 1954. Raymond Armington became general manager of the new Euclid division. George Armington Sr., the patriarch who founded the electric hoist company in 1907, watched the deal close at the age of 89. He died in 1954, 1 year after the sale. The GM acquisition had consequences that nobody anticipated. Before GM bought Euclid, contractors could choose between a Cummins diesel engine or a Detroit diesel engine. After the acquisition, the Cummins option quietly disappeared. In 1955, the United States Senate Antitrust and Monopoly Subcommittee hauled General Motors into hearings that ran from November 23rd to December 8th. Raymond Armington was the principal witness. He told the senators that his family simply had not possessed the capital to compete with larger manufacturers. Then a Cummins engine company official took the stand. His testimony was devastating. Euclid's purchases of Cummins engines had dropped to roughly 25% of their former levels within 2 years of the GM takeover. The difference had gone directly to Detroit Diesel, a GM subsidiary. The Department of Justice took note. For 4 years after the hearings, nothing happened publicly. GM expanded Euclid's production. The Hudson plant came online. New product lines launched. The Armington brothers began retiring one by one. Stuart and Everett Armington stepped down in 1953, the same year as the sale. George Jr. retired in 1958. The green trucks kept shipping. The assembly lines kept running. Everything appeared stable from the outside. Then on October 15, 1959, Attorney General William P. Rogers filed an antitrust suit under Section 7 of the Clayton Act against General Motors Corporation. The government alleged that General Motors' acquisition of Euclid threatened to create a monopoly and substantially lessen competition in the off-highway hauler and earth-moving equipment market. The suit demanded complete divestiture. One remarkable legal detail that has never appeared in any documentary about Euclid is that GM successfully argued for a venue transfer from New York to Cleveland because their evidence included actual items of earth-moving equipment that were too large and too heavy to be licensed for highway transport to New York. We need to understand the scale of what the Department of Justice was attempting. General Motors in 1959 was the largest industrial corporation on Earth, employing over 600,000 people worldwide. And the federal government was telling them to give back a dump truck company from Ohio that they had legally purchased 6 years earlier. General Motors fought the case with every legal resource available to the largest corporation in America. The litigation dragged on for 8 years. 8 years of depositions, motions, expert witnesses, legal briefs, and courtroom hearings in the Northern District of Ohio. And during those 8 years, the Euclid division sat in a kind of corporate limbo that proved more destructive than the lawsuit itself. GM could not make major capital investments in new Euclid truck designs without risking the outcome of the litigation. If General Motors spent hundreds of millions developing the next generation of Euclid haulers, and then a court-ordered divestiture, those investments would walk out the door with the forced sale. The rational corporate decision was to freeze development and wait. And that is exactly what happened. By 1965, the Euclid product lineup had gone stagnant. The trucks that had defined the market a decade earlier were now aging designs competing against newer, more efficient machines from companies that had spent the 1960s investing while Euclid waited. In 1960, Raymond Armington, the youngest brother, retired as general manager. He was the last Armington. After 53 years of family involvement, no Armington remained at the company they built. In 1968, General Motors surrendered. On February 15th, White Motor Corporation purchased the American truck operations and the Euclid brand name. Here is what General Motors kept: the factory in Motherwell, Scotland, the Canadian plants, the crawler tractors, motor scrapers, and wheel loaders, every international dealership in the world, and the right to build the exact same trucks under a new name. In October 1968, General Motors renamed its retained operations Terex, from the Latin terra for earth and rex for king. The trucks rolling out of the Motherwell plant and the Canadian factories were mechanically identical to the Euclids they had always been. Same frames, same axles, same Screaming Jimmy engines. Different nameplate. The Bucyrus-Erie documentary on this channel covers a remarkably similar pattern, where a dominant American equipment manufacturer gets dismembered, and its engineering continues under different names across the globe. During the transition, General Motors Scotland went so far as to grind the Euclid name off trucks still operating in the United Kingdom under lease arrangements. White Motor Corporation operated Euclid as a subsidiary called Euclid Incorporated. The company remained profitable initially, but White lacked the resources for the aggressive product development that the off-highway truck market now demanded. Caterpillar was investing heavily. Komatsu was entering the American market from Japan. White had the name and the American plants, but the global infrastructure that made Euclid dominant, the Scottish factory, the Canadian plants, the worldwide dealer network, had all stayed with General Motors. When the antitrust restrictions expired on July 1, 1972, General Motors immediately re-entered the American hauler market with Terex-branded trucks derived directly from Euclid engineering. The trucks wearing the Terex name were built on the same designs, in the same factories, by the same workers who had built them as Euclids 4 years earlier. The antitrust case, intended to protect the smaller company from monopoly power, had handed General Motors the stronger half of the business and left White Motor holding a domestic shell with no international reach. But here is the part of the Euclid story that no other documentary has ever told. In 1971, under White Motor ownership, Euclid built a single prototype that pushed the boundaries of mining truck technology further than anyone had attempted. The R210 was a 210-ton articulated dump truck powered by an Avco-Lycoming aviation-derived gas turbine, producing approximately 1,850 horsepower, burning jet fuel. The turbine drove a generator feeding electric motors on all 4 wheels. The dump body was so enormous it had to be cut in half to navigate the winding road from Arawa Port up to the Panguna copper mine on Bougainville Island in Papua New Guinea, then reassembled on site. In 1975, on a long 12% downgrade carrying approximately 240 tons of copper ore, the gas turbine flamed out. With the engine dead, the truck lost all power, including brakes. Park brakes burned through. The truck remained steerable, but accelerated downhill to approximately 60 miles per hour before slamming into a Caterpillar 14E motor grader and continuing into an Isuzu bucket truck. Eyewitnesses at the mine reported that the kerosene fuel was not agreeing with the engine. A former worker who was there in 1974 and 1975 recalled co-workers named Paul Higgins, who was known as Henry, and Ted Kunz from Euclid. Another claimed the runaway happened at least twice on different days. A former heavy equipment fitter who worked at the mine said he still possesses the original Euclid badge from the truck's radiator grille. The gas turbine concept failed for fundamental reasons. Turbines work best at constant speed and have terrible throttle response for the stop and start cycle of mining operations. Dust ingestion damages turbocine blades far faster than diesel pistons. Field repairs were virtually impossible in a remote Pacific Island mine. And the 1973 oil crisis made jet fuel economics catastrophic for any operator trying to run a mining fleet. The Panguna mine itself closed in 1989 when civil conflict erupted on Bougainville Island. The fate of the R210 is unknown. No other manufacturer successfully deployed a gas turbine mining truck until Belarus-based Belazi tested a 90-ton prototype in 2025. If you want to see more documentaries about the companies and the families that built the construction equipment industry, like and subscribe now. The Lost Giants series covers the names that the equipment world has forgotten. Through the 1970s, White Motor Corporation struggled financially under pressures that had nothing to do with Euclid. The parent company's truck business was hemorrhaging money. In August 1977, White sold Euclid to Daimler-Benz of West Germany. The German automaker brought capital and engineering resources that White never had. Daimler-Benz added articulated dump trucks to the Euclid line and began expanding into international markets. For a brief moment, it appeared that Euclid might recover under European ownership. But the early 1980s brought the worst recession the construction and mining equipment industry had experienced since the Depression. Demand for heavy haulers collapsed worldwide. In North America alone, the construction equipment market contracted by over 40% between 1981 and 1983. Caterpillar laid off thousands. Komatsu pulled back from international markets. In January 1984, Daimler-Benz sold Euclid to Clark Michigan Company. Clark took one look at the aging St. Clair Avenue plant in Cleveland and closed it at the beginning of 1985. The factory, where 1,600 workers had once built 170 trucks per month, went silent. The workers were laid off. Lincoln Electric Company purchased the empty building in 1988. Their corporate headquarters now sits at 202-221 St. Clair Avenue, Cleveland, Ohio, the old Euclid factory address. Clark formed a joint venture with Volvo called VME, short for Volvo Michigan Euclid. In December 1993, a new joint venture with Hitachi Construction Machinery of Japan created Euclid Hitachi Heavy Equipment. Hitachi wanted dump trucks to complement its mining excavators. By the year 2000, Hitachi owned 100%. Production moved from Ohio to Guelph, Ontario, Canada. The move from Ohio to Canada ended 93 years of continuous heavy equipment manufacturing in the greater Cleveland area that had begun when George Armington relocated his hoist shop from Wycliffe to Euclid before the First World War. On January 1, 2004, Hitachi formally abolished the Euclid name. The company became Hitachi Construction Truck Manufacturing Limited. After 95 years, the name was gone. The castings deep inside the trucks still carried the Euclid name because casting molds are too expensive to retool for branding alone. But on the outside, where operators and mine managers could see it, the word was erased. The bright green paint was gone. The Euclid logo plates were gone. What remained was Hitachi Orange and a Japanese company name. But 5 of the Euclid engineers who were laid off refused to stop building trucks. David Juba and Manny Naft cashed in their severance packages and founded Pioneer Solutions LLC with 31 former Euclid Hitachi employees. They set up shop in the same 22,221 St. Clair Avenue, 120,000 square foot building where Euclid trucks had been designed for decades. They contracted back to Hitachi and Terex, designing heavy truck components. The Euclid workforce, even when the name was gone, refused to quit. The Motherwell factory in Scotland, established in 1950, had been building off-highway trucks continuously through every ownership change for 76 years. It produced its 1,000th truck within 4 years of opening. In 1982, Motherwell engineers designed the first Terex articulated dump truck. After passing through GM, IBH Holding, Terex Corporation, and finally Volvo Construction Equipment, which paid $160 million for the truck lines in December 2013. The facility was rebranded Rockbach in 2021. On March 17, 2026, Volvo Construction Equipment announced the closure of the Rockbach business. The RA30 and RA40 articulated haulers will cease production in the second half of 2026. Up to 120 workers at the Motherwell facility will lose their jobs. Rockbach had revenues of approximately $107 million in 2025, but was operating at a loss. A Volvo spokesperson told reporters that with Scotland outside the European Union, the regulatory burden of exporting trucks had become unsustainable. North Lanarkshire Council leader Jim Logue said that the Motherwell factory had been part of the economic fabric of North Lanarkshire since 1950. The factory will not close entirely. It continues as a hub for Volvo rigid haulers, but the articulated truck line born at that facility in 1982, the last commercial echo of the Euclid earth-moving legacy, is ending in 2026. The Euclid name lived on in one unexpected place. The dinky Super Toys No. 965 Euclid rear dump truck, produced by Meccano Limited in Liverpool from 1955 to 1970, became one of the most collected die-cast models ever made. The design drawing was completed on October 12, 1953, barely 2 weeks after the GM acquisition was announced. A collector named David Knight wrote online that he received a dinky Euclid from his grandfather on Christmas morning in 1956 at age 11. He restored it decades later, and he wrote that he could still hear his grandfather's voice saying he hoped the boy would like it. The toy outlasted the company by half a century. The Euclid story is not about bad management or failed engineering. Every machine the Armingtons built worked. The Model 1Z created an industry. The Model 1F set a baseline that made competitors obsolete. The twin power concept pushed hauling capacity to new limits. The TC-12 was the most powerful crawler tractor on Earth. And the Euclid name was so thoroughly embedded in the language of American construction that an entire generation of operators never learned to call the machines anything else. The problem was never the machines. The problem was that a family company became too valuable for its own survival. General Motors bought them because they were dominant. The Department of Justice broke them apart because GM made them too dominant. And every owner who came after bought the name hoping to recapture something that had already been divided, relocated, and stripped of the infrastructure that made it powerful. 8 owners across 4 countries, over 5 decades. George Armington started with electric hoists in 1907. Arthur turned them into earth movers and locomotive builders and highway truck manufacturers before anyone understood what he was creating. The 5 brothers built dump trucks that became the industry standard. The name became the word for the machine. And then the word was taken away. The last Armington retired in 1960. The last Euclid truck rolled off an American assembly line in the 1980s. The last time anyone stamped the name Euclid on a new machine was 2003. But somewhere today, in a copper mine in Chile or a quarry in New Zealand, where 70-year-old R-15 trucks still haul rock every morning, a dump truck with the Euclid name still fading on its steel flank is working right now. The machine outlasted the company. The engineering outlasted the name. And every off-highway dump truck on every job site in America still owes something to a father and 5 sons who started building electric hoists in a small Ohio town called Wycliffe over a century ago.